It's December 3rd here in Seoul, and I'm Kim Dami. We begin with the stories making the headlines at this hour, starting with some positive news regarding inflation. Consumer prices in South Korea rose 1.5% in November, a sign that inflation may be under control, with the figure hovering below the 2% range for the third straight month. The U.S. says it's slapping a new chip export control package on China, including restrictions on high-end chips for AI that will also likely strike a blow against South Korean firms. Israel struck targets in southern Lebanon, leaving 2 people dead on Monday, with Hezbollah also firing projectiles at Israel. While expressing concerns, Washington at the same time believes the ongoing ceasefire is still being considered a success. Consumer prices in South Korea continues to stabilize on the back of low oil prices, with inflation remaining in the 1% range for 3 straight months. Data from the Statistics Korea on Tuesday showed that the country's consumer price index, a key gauge of inflation, rose 1.5% in November compared to the same month last year. Oil prices fell by more than 5%, contributing to the decline in price hikes, but vegetable prices remained high, increasing more than 10% year-on-year. President Jaemincheon will hold a summit with Kyrgyz President Japarov on Tuesday as South Korea looks to increase engagement with Kyrgyzstan and other Central Asian countries. According to Yoon's office, the leaders will meet at around 11 a.m. at the Yongsan presidential office during Japarov's official visit to South Korea. The presidents are expected to discuss ways to expand cooperation in trade, investment, development cooperation, and people-to-people exchanges, as well as regional and international issues. Now, following their talks, a joint signing ceremony will take place before an official luncheon. Earlier this year, South Korea announced its new K-Silk Road initiative to engage with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. And a summit between Seoul and the 5 Central Asian countries is expected to take place here in South Korea next year. Reports of Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire agreement violations continue to be reported, as 2 people were killed in an Israeli airstrike in southern Lebanon on Monday. Despite this, Washington says the ceasefire agreement has been successful. Lee Seung-jae reports.
On the 6th day of the 60-day ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hezbollah, 2 people were killed in an Israeli airstrike in southern Lebanon on Monday. According to the Lebanese Health Ministry, 1 person was killed in an Israeli airstrike some 10 kilometers from the Israeli border. It added that the other fatality was a soldier on duty 12 kilometers from the border who was killed in an Israeli drone attack. Nabi Berri, the Speaker of the Lebanese parliament who mediated the ceasefire on behalf of Hezbollah, issued a statement condemning the attack as a clear violation of the terms of the ceasefire agreement. However, the Israeli military also claimed that it had carried out several airstrikes in Lebanon over the past few days in response to what they say were Hezbollah's violations of the ceasefire agreement. With both sides accusing each other of violations, Hezbollah fired 2 projectiles toward Israeli-occupied territory, marking its first attack since the ceasefire went into effect. Reports say that both the U.S. and French governments have issued warnings to Israel, saying they believe the Israeli military has violated the ceasefire agreement. UNIFIL, the UN peacekeeping force in Lebanon, also said that Israel breached the ceasefire agreement approximately 100 times since last week. Despite this, the U.S. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller says the ceasefire agreement has been successful.
So what we have seen since the ceasefire went into effect is it being successful. Broadly speaking, it has been successful in stopping the fighting and getting us on a path where we are not seeing the just daily loss of life that we had seen for 2 months prior.
Saying any ceasefire agreement would see some violations, Miller said Washington and Paris have set up a mechanism to look into reports of violations, adding it will engage with the Israeli and Lebanese military. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
The UN reports that at least 44 civilians have died and nearly 50,000 have been displaced since the civil war intensified in northwestern Syria last month. According to a situation report released by the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, continuous airstrikes and shelling have been reported in Idlib and Aleppo regions. It added that another 162 people have been injured. Among the dead were 12 children and 7 women. The report raised concerns that the number of refugees has been rising at an alarming pace, jumping more than 14,000 last week to more than 48,500. Foreign ministers of the 32 NATO countries are holding their last meeting of the year this week, with Ukraine now insisting that NATO membership could help end the hot phase with Russia. Let's turn to Dr. Ronald Suni for more. Hello there, Dr. Suni.
Hello, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm in good shape.
Let's start with what Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is insisting. He's saying the membership would allow him to negotiate a ceasefire deal with Russia. Now, isn't this the first time that Zelensky has mentioned the possibility of a ceasefire?
In the past, Zelensky has talked about, ending the war, but with no concessions of territory whatsoever to the Russians. That is, they even claim they want Crimea back, which Russians have held since 2014. But now, Zelensky is saying that he could see making concessions. He's being very careful. That is, they could stop the war now where the armies are standing, because recently the Russians have been advancing. The Ukrainians are running out of manpower. So this is very important that finally they bring this thing to an end. And then later, Zelensky says, we can decide diplomatically about whether there would be concessions made about the land. So he says, let's stop the hot war now. We can talk about concessions later. This is new.
But I'm sure NATO itself is in a very challenging, position. What kind of stance will NATO take with just 1 month left until the Biden administration in the U.S. ends its term?
First of all, the Russian government has made it clear that it will not tolerate NATO membership.
Right.
Ukraine can go into the European Union, but not NATO membership. The Trump-Vance government, according to Vance's statements in September, were that the land concessions would be made to the Russians, but Ukraine would remain neutral, not in NATO. Zelensky, on the other hand, in this latest statement, is saying, okay, we can have a ceasefire, but NATO must guarantee the unoccupied parts of Ukraine remain under NATO protection. So you see, it's a very delicate negotiation. And everyone is waiting for the Trump administration to take power. We have a very strange situation here in the United States. We have a kind of interregnum, or better to say, we have what Russians once called dual power. There are two governments.
Right.
There's the actual government that's ruling, Biden, and then there's the anticipated Trump government, which is putting people into positions of power who are pushing for this new ceasefire and concessions to Russia.
Dr. Suni, then let's talk about the incoming Trump administration. Like you mentioned, Trump's Ukraine envoy pick is Keith Kellogg. Now, he's been all about ending the war. What kind of deal do you think the Trump administration and Kellogg will offer Ukraine instead of giving Ukraine the NATO membership that it's been eager to get?
General Kellogg was a critic and is still a critic of the Biden administration. They went too slow. They didn't do enough. We should fight this war. And now, as he's moved toward the Trump administration, he's accepted the Trump position that there ought to be a ceasefire, that the war should come to an end. And it's clear that Trump, for all of his faults and all of his ways of acting, in fact, wants to bring these wars to an end. And he's ready to make concessions to Russia in order to bring the war in Ukraine to an end. He doesn't seem to like wars, foreign wars that the United States is wasting its money and manpower in, mostly money, of course. And he's also planning in some odd way to bring the war in Gaza also to an end. But there he's going to make major concessions through his Christian Zionist appointments, like the new ambassador to Israel. That will, in fact, basically end any Palestinian dreams of statehood.
I see. Well, let's talk about other partners getting involved in the Ukraine crisis, not just Russia, but also North Korea, having already transferred over, reportedly, 100 artillery systems. The question is, will these systems actually play a big role in taking down the Russian forces?
So Russia, like Ukraine, has suffered from a manpower shortage. The Ukrainians have no one but Ukrainians to fight their wars. Americans fight wars by supplying arms and intelligence, but no manpower.
Right.
We fight other people's bodies. But Russia has solved its manpower problem. First of all, Putin doesn't want to have a mobilization of Russians because there's opposition to that. People flee abroad, etc. And so how did they solve it? They're having North Koreans come. Tens of thousands. Who knows how many will come? They're already in Kursk. Fighting is going on. Ukraine is claiming that some North Koreans have been killed. And the North Koreans are using their artillery against Ukraine. So this is a war now between Russia and North Korea on one side, Ukraine and NATO on the other.
Well, Dr. Suni, like you mentioned, we don't know how many more soldiers from North Korea to be dispatched to Russia, but what's your take on it? How many rounds of deployment to Russia to come in the future, and how often or until how long?
Here's the main thing. Right now, Russia is advancing. The Ukrainians are adding to their manpower. They're in a more powerful position. Ukrainians have realized, and the West has realized, and even NATO has realized, that if the war goes on, the Russians are going to triumph, and just more and more Ukrainians, as well as Russians and North Koreans, will be killed. So this is a war of attrition. And all sides now are interested in some kind of ceasefire. And that may come in the next months, I would think, in the first month or two after Trump gets into office. And Russia's biggest backer, remember, is China, and China has repeatedly called for the Russians to bring this war in Ukraine to an end.
Alrighty, Dr. Suni, thanks much for sharing your insight and your time with us this morning. You enjoy your evening there.
You too. 감사합니다.
Washington has introduced new export controls aimed at limiting China's semiconductor and AI development, now which could impact major South Korean semiconductor companies like SK Hynix and Samsung Electronics. Yoon explains.
The U.S. government announced Monday the introduction of new export controls to limit China's ability to build advanced semiconductors and develop AI for military use. The restrictions affect both U.S. companies and foreign companies that use American technology in their chip-making equipment. As part of the controls, the U.S. will also stop exporting HBM, or high-bandwidth memory, which is vital for AI chips, to China. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce, the new measures, which follow two similar packages over the past 2 years, are aimed at limiting China's ability to produce advanced chips for its military modernization. 140 Chinese companies were added to the Commerce Department's export curb list, which means U.S. and foreign companies, including chip manufacturers like Huawei and companies that make the equipment to produce chips, require a license to export to them. The new rules cover 24 types of chip-making tools not previously restricted. The U.S. will also apply a rule called the Foreign Direct Product Rule, which will impact non-U.S. companies using U.S. technology in their tools. Most chip-making tools are in this category. Washington has reportedly exempted Japan and some European allies, including the Netherlands, after they agreed to set their own export restrictions. South Korea may get an exemption later. But the move could negatively affect South Korean companies like SK Hynix and Samsung Electronics, which control over 90% of the global HBM market. Samsung, in particular, may be impacted as a large portion of its HBM sales, around 30%, go to China, including through Hong Kong. On the same day, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Jian criticized U.S. restrictions, saying they are disruptive to international trade and supply chains. He said that China would take action to protect its companies' rights. China's Commerce Ministry also condemned the U.S. curbs, calling them a form of economic coercion and unfair practices. This comes shortly before Republican President-elect Donald Trump takes office, and he's expected to continue many of Biden's tough measures against China. Yoon, Arirang News.
U.S. automaker General Motors has announced it will sell its share in a $2.6 billion EV battery plant in Michigan to its partner, South Korea's LG Energy Solution. GM confirmed in a press release on Monday that the sale is part of a non-binding agreement with the South Korean battery supplier, with the sale set for the first quarter of next year. The nearly completed plant in Lansing was meant to be the third battery facility of their joint venture, Ultium Cells LLC, after plants in Ohio and Tennessee. GM is adjusting its EV production due to slower consumer demand and also uncertainty over future EV incentives. The car maker expects to get back its $1 billion investment in the plant. Efforts continue to jazz up Korea's small towns. Among them is Jaemincheon village, being revitalized by young people's creative ideas. Our Park Gona checked it out.
Rejuvenating previously abandoned spaces. Jaemincheon village, once at the epicenter of Gongju city, located in Chungcheongnam-do province, had been abandoned for many years. That's until several young people, relocated from other areas including the capital region, started revitalizing vacant houses and unused spaces with the support of the Interior Ministry. This old house was once a tailor shop but was abandoned for many years. But now, thanks to the creativity and dedication of young people who have moved into this area, it has been transformed into an inviting and cozy cafe. These remodeled structures built decades ago have not just turned into cafes, but also restaurants and guest houses and hotels with the creative ideas of young resettlers. Thanks to these efforts, the total population, which includes residents and the floating population like tourists, has been rising continuously. Over 126,000 more people were added to that total population in Q2 of 2024 compared to the previous quarter. That's especially noticeable as Gongju City has been designated by the Interior Ministry as one of the 89 areas in Korea seeing a population shrink. One young worker who moved into the area says there's still some space for improvement.
It's still lacking in infrastructure for young people to come here. I hope that in the near future it can become a neighborhood where those young people can live a happier life while doing what they want.
However, despite some inconveniences, one young restaurant owner says that can be a strength.
Seoul is very complex, competitive, and things are built and they disappear quickly. It's a much slower pace here, and I find that more attractive. Local residents are very friendly, enough to help you and give advice, which has been really encouraging.
She added she wishes to keep living as a small local restaurant owner even in the future, so that she can keep introducing the beauty of Korean food to people visiting the region. Park Gonu, Arirang News, Gongju.
Now, let's take a look at the stories from around the world with our Kim Seong. Good morning, Seong.
Good morning, Dami.
So why don't we begin in France and some expected political instability there. What's going on?
Yeah, that's right, Dami. The French government is facing almost certain collapse as opposition parties plan to vote for a no-confidence motion. Now, both the left-wing coalition and populist right-wing have said they plan to vote for a no-confidence motion against Prime Minister Michel Barnier, who said he will force a divisive social security budget through Parliament without a vote on Monday. The French minority government's Prime Minister invoked Article 49.3 of the country's constitution on Monday to push his budget through without a vote in Parliament. Now, furious opposition parties responded, saying they would oust the new PM in a vote that could take place as soon as Wednesday. Left-wing MP Alexis Corbière said Monday that that's it for Barnier, he's out of here, while National Rally Party leader Marine Le Pen said she could bring down the government if the country's budget bill stays as it is. Barnier is almost certain to lose in a vote of no confidence, which would make him the shortest-serving Prime Minister since 1958. Now, the budget bill for the coming year must be passed by December 21st. In Guinea, a crowd crush following a fan violence at a football game on Sunday has killed at least 56 people. According to a local journalist covering the game, many of the deaths took place by the stadium gates, where spectators rushed to escape, causing a stampede. Now, Guinea News said rival fans stormed the game field in protest of a referee's call. Witnesses say security forces also deployed tear gas. Now, the crush happened at the final of a football tournament in Nzerekore, one of the country's largest cities. The West African country has announced 3 days of national mourning starting Tuesday. US chipmaker Intel announced on Monday that its CEO, Pat Gelsinger, has retired from the company after a difficult tenure failing to revive the former industry leader. Intel said Gelsinger's retirement was effective as of December 1st. Now, 63-year-old Gelsinger, who has worked for Intel for decades, returned as the company's chief executive officer in February 2021. The semiconductor giant's stock price plunged 61% during his near 4-year stint. Intel in August said that it would lay off over 15% of its staff as part of a $10 billion cost reduction plan, which Gelsinger said was necessary to fundamentally change the way we operate. Now, Intel named David Zinsner and Michelle Johnston Holthaus as interim co-CEOs until the board agrees on a new CEO. 77-year-old British singer Elton John said on Monday that he was unable to watch the theatrical piece he wrote the score for as he has lost his sight. Speaking on the red carpet for the launch of the musical The Devil Wears Prada, he said that it's hard for me to see, but I love to hear it, and it sounded good tonight. Elton John previously said in a November interview that he had lost his vision in his right eye while on vacation in July. He said that his left eye was also not the greatest, meaning he may no longer be able to see or watch or read anything.
After the dusty but warm afternoon we had yesterday, which helped to melt the snow and see the leftover autumn leaves that were covered with snow, things have gotten much colder again. Seoul is below -2 degrees, but it feels like -5, and Incheon is under a cold wave advisory this morning. And Paju and Cheoron are waking up to a colder morning. Temperatures have dropped to 5 to 10 degrees lower than yesterday, and colder air will keep below average temperatures in play for the first half of the week, along with strong winds. Now, it will stay partly to mostly sunny during the day, but from tonight, some of the capital area in Chungcheongdo and Jeollabuk-do provinces could see a mix of rain and snow. Then Jeollado provinces are forecast to see frequent snow at the end of the week. Checking on today's highs now, Seoul gets up to only 4 degrees, which is about 10 degrees lower than yesterday. Daegu and Gongju will make it to 8 degrees. Stay cozy and warm today. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That's all we have for this morning. We thank you for watching New Day at Arirang.